Hello, and welcome to this public webinar at the Beyond the Horizon International Strategic Studies Group. We are thrilled that you joined us for this event. Today, we are going to be talking about the crisis in Libya from the refugees or irregular migration perspective, which has been shadowed by the dazzling developments since the beginning of this year. We will particularly focus on the happenings inside Libya, in the Mediterranean, and of course, within the European Union since the spread of COVID-19. Just last week, more than 100 people died off the coast of Libya. And I think this is quite the right timing to discuss this issue. My name is Arman Atak, Libya analyst here at the Horizon and research fellow at the Master University. Today, I will be moderating this event and will be the first speaker to provide an update on the political and security dimensions of the turmoil in and around Libya. I'm delighted to have with me today Judith Sunderland and Hasiba Haj Sahrawi from Doctors Without Borders, Judith from Human Rights Watch. First, I would like to introduce both Hasiba and Judith to our audience very shortly. Hasiba Haj Sahrawi is Humanitarian Affairs Advisor with MSF in Amsterdam, where she leads on migration with a focus on search and rescue in the Mediterranean and sea situations for the migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in Libya. Before joining the MSF, Hasiba was the Amnesty International Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa. She has also been a legal officer with the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva. Today, Hasiba will enlighten us on the happenings inside Libya and infamous Libya detention centers, and of course, with their sides facing the EU. Judith Sunderland is acting Deputy Director for the Human Rights Watch Europe and Central Asia Division. She has particular expertise in migration and asylum policy, and her recent work has included research and advocacy on EU asylum policy, including migration cooperation with Libya. Before joining the Human Rights Watch, Judith worked as a UN human rights observer and as a journalist. Today, Judith will primarily speak about the sea crossings, search and rescue operations, disembarkations, and asylum procedures. A very warm welcome to both Judith and Hasiba. The way we will run this conversation is that first, we will have 10 minutes each to present our topics. And in the second part, we will open the floor for the Q&A. Our audience is following this live webinar from Zoom and Facebook, but you can only ask your questions from Zoom using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. You can write your questions down anytime. I will be reading and directing them to our panel in the second part. And I encourage you to ask any questions you have. Just to let you know, we will be recording this webinar and will publish it on web for further referencing. We have 1 hour at most. We can finish it earlier, but not much later for the sake of making it more comprehensible and fun for our audience. So without further ado, here we begin with me with an update on the political and security dimensions of the crisis in Libya. Just a second, let me share my screen for a Libya map. Yes. Since the fall of Gaddafi, as a result of internal conflicts and destructive external interferences, this vast and resource-rich country with around 1.9 thousand kilometers coastline to the Mediterranean has become a failed state. Libya, once a final destination for thousands of migrants, now became a transit country for thousands of irregular migrants and asylum seekers. These EU-aspiring desperate people have been suffering from extreme human rights violations, together with rapidly changing regional and global dynamics. The conditions of people has been worsening. In addition to its crucial humanitarian extent, we see that discussions around migration is a source of dissent and contention and competition between the EU member states, and has been threatening the solidarity and damaging the reputation of the EU. We know that EU has been threatening, we know that EU has been working on new migration management regulations, which will replace the Dublin regulation. I'm not sure if it will solve the problems, but I'm very much eager to hear what Hasibe and Judith will say about it. To set the scene, let me continue with what has been going on in political and security dimensions. In the last decade, the crisis has passed many stages, and we ended up with the current stalemate we have today. Spread of COVID-19 didn't stop the armed fighting in the country, and even worse, in the first half of the 2020, we have witnessed a military escalation. In the summer of this year, finally, the factions of the civil war reached a balance of power at the Sirte-Jufra front, almost at the center of the country, that line. And parties agreed upon a permanent ceasefire in Geneva in late October as part of post-Berlin Conference 5+5 military negotiations. This deal came following a multi-level negotiations in several countries, including Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Malta, and even Russia. And this month, the second part of the military negotiations continued inside Libya in Ghadames and Sirte, where they agreed on the modalities of the permanent ceasefire. These military negotiations paved the way on EU-sponsored Libya Political Dialogue Forum, which is named as LPDF. These negotiations started online first on 2nd of November and continued with in-person negotiations in Tunis from 9 till 15th of November. The purpose of the LPDF was to generate consensus on a unified governance framework and on arrangements that will lead to holding the national elections. And as a result, LPDF members agreed on holding the elections next year on the 24th of December. UN is highly hopeful about the process. These are definitely crucial steps towards achieving the lasting peace, but it is early to celebrate or to name it as a historical moment. In the decade of post-revolution, Libyans witnessed many such agreements, decisions to hold elections, such as Paris Conference in 2017, also Palermo Conference in 2018, and Abu Dhabi meetings in 2019, which aroused great expectations, but ended up with failure at the end. Either those delegations at the negotiations were not representative enough, or parties did not honor their commitments following the agreements, and a new wave of conflict took over the scene. But the real problem is, let me stop sharing the, the map. Okay. But the real problem is not holding the elections. It's about the modalities, rules, and regulations of the elections. In fact, the constitution itself, because the rules and regulations will critically be designed, the new power holders in the government, in the military and economy, who will head the new unified government, and which of the armed groups and militias will turn into legitimate Libya armed forces, police forces, or security apparatus, who will control the Libya's financial institutions, etc. This is the core of the problem. So I think that overemphasizing the significance of the election date may be misleading. I sound quite skeptical about the success of the process, I know. There are a couple of reasons for that. First, the two main actors are not reliable and not one solid body. They are a coalition. Sarraj is not an elected prime minister, having no public or tribal support. He relies on the militia groups in Tripoli. GNA coalition consists of various groups, like 4 big Tripoli militia groups, Misratans, part of Sintanis, political Islamists, These groups came together against their common enemy, Haftar. And once the Haftar ceased to be a threat last summer, we started to see that internal power struggles and conflict of interests taking over. As for the ceasefire agreement and political negotiations, some groups inside GNA already started to make conflicting declarations. And on the other side, we have Haftar, who is notorious with his not honoring his promises. Then in such a unreliable ground, it is not easy to be optimistic. So to wrap up, armed fighting currently stopped. A UN-sponsored negotiation process took over. Even though expectations high, there are quite significant obstacles on the road. The high level of distrust between warring parties, the high level of fragmentation within the factions, the high level of foreign meddling and complex ideological, political, and economic relations. And last but not least, the zero-sum game approach existent among some actors make me see the developments from a very pessimistic angle. For the sake of making a success out of it, EU, together with other international actors, should stay vigilant, support this process, and play their role by sanctioning, condemning, criticizing, and punishing the spoilers of the process. Otherwise, conflict may flare up again. So I will stop here and hand it over to Hasiba. Hasiba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. You've rightly so highlighted that Libya has always attracted migrant refugees and asylum seekers, that it was a place where a lot of migrant workers were going to in order to find better work opportunities. But I think they've always been quite vulnerable, or there were migrant refugees and asylum seekers were vulnerable already under the rule of Gaddafi. And we do know that the Italian authorities at the time had tried to secure a deal with the Libyan authorities to try to stem the flow of arrivals to Europe. And Muammar Gaddafi was already seeing migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers as some sort of leverage he could use against the European Union. And but I think the situations was compounded by the conflict that started in 2011. But let's focus on the most recent event. When the COVID pandemic hit the world, of course, it didn't spare Libya. And in a situation where migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers were already extremely vulnerable, it's interesting to see how they were particularly impacted or not by COVID. When I say that migrant refugees and asylum seekers are particularly vulnerable in Libya, I have in mind in particular the fact that irregular migration is criminalized in Libya, and that anyone irregular entry, stay, or exit are criminalized. What it means, and this is why MSF was present or has been present in Libya since 2016, is that you have a significant number of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers who end up in detention centers under the control of the Ministry of the Interior, but more specifically under the control of the Department for Combating Illegal Migration. And that's simply because they're not able, for some of them, to prove to the authorities that they are legally in the country. We are aware of situations where people are legally in the country but are still in the detention centers, or people who are refugees recognized by UNHCR, or nationals of countries that are considered as originating refugees are in these detention centers. So we had that vulnerability, and then you've mentioned also the group dynamics and the armed groups. Migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers were also seen as some sort of economic or a source of income, but also a source of power by different armed groups. If you control migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, it means you have access to money because you might be able to extort them, extort their families. I'm thinking in particular of Somalis or Eritreans who are seen as having access to income coming from the diaspora, but also you might be able to get money out of them through either pushing them on the sea, but also passing them to other groups who might try to use them for political leverage or for economic power. And the situation was then made much worse in April 2019 when the conflict hit Tripoli again. We had thousands of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in detention centers. Some of these detention centers were in the very close vicinity of the conflict. Some were on the front lines. And that meant difficulty for organizations such as MSF, but also the UN, to safely provide assistance, but it also means being directly at risk. And we've seen that, for example, in the detention center of Tajura, that was hit twice in the span of a few weeks, with dozens of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers reported dead after a strike on the detention center. And since then, there have been an impetus to try to release people out of these detention centers. And I'll come back to that because we are in this phase as well, where we are seeing migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers being released. The numbers of people in the detention center vary extremely over time. There are times where, for example, MSF was present in Tajura and there were about 6,000 people held. And now these days we're talking about 2,400 or at max 3,000 people being held in these detention centers. However, we need to see behind these figures. Then COVID struck the country. And so we have migrant, refugees, and asylum seekers who are particularly vulnerable to COVID because of their living conditions. You have to imagine detention centers that are severely overcrowded, where access to water and sanitation is limited, and therefore the very simple measures to try to avoid being infected or to protect yourself are not met. You can't really implement distanciation from other detainees, and you can't necessarily wash your hands. So very simple things because you don't have access to running water. And it is the same for the migrants living in urban settings, so in Tripoli, where their living conditions are also extremely bleak. No access to healthcare as well. And we will see that this is a key issue. In the middle of a pandemic, we have seen more than ever that migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers do not have access to healthcare, or that their access to healthcare is extremely limited. So, and then you had the situation being made worse by, on the one hand, the security situation. The fighting was raging in Tripoli over the beginning of the COVID crisis, but also the authorities decided then to adopt a number of measures to combat COVID. So that meant a curfew, that meant closing of the border, and that has impacted the ability of organizations such as MSF to provide services as well to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in the detention centers and outside the detention centers. Very difficult as well for us to be able to have staff available to provide medical care. So we had a crisis within a crisis within a crisis. So migrants, refugees, asylum seekers are very vulnerable for a range of reasons in Libya. Then they were rendered even more vulnerable by the conflict. And then on top of that, then you had COVID and the number of measures taken that themselves to combat COVID that themselves had an impact on their ability to earn a livelihood. And for some of these migrants, what they earn that day is what they're going to eat. With NGOs and UN organizations not able to really deliver assistance to these migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, no clear access to healthcare, sometimes for those in detention centers, but those out because NGOs are providing that healthcare. But outside the detention center, it's very unclear. And a country that had health facilities that had been dilapidated partly by the conflict, and a very weak health system due to years of conflict, but also due to shortage of staff, etc. So that's the situation. And then to make it worse, in a way, UNHCR, the refugee agency, and the International Organization for Migration that had been providing assistance, including evacuating some of the most vulnerable people out of Libya with a view to them being resettled in other countries, or for IOM facilitating voluntary repatriation, these two organizations suspended all their flights out of Libya. So here you truly had migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers stuck in Libya with very little access to services, with dangers represented, one, by the conflict, second, by the pandemic, and also against a general backdrop of violence against migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And people were stuck with very, very limited services. So what we've seen is also, and what we are seeing these days, is a tendency and statements made by the Libyan authorities and the detaining authorities that they want to close the detention centers. We've seen some of them being emptied. For example, the detention center in Homs, where people were there transferred to Tripoli. We are seeing as well the detention center in Zintan being on its way to being emptied. However, the alternative, what are the alternatives to detention? And I think we once again confronted to how vulnerable people are to violence by armed groups, criminal gangs, and others, but also how weak the protection machinery by the UN is in Libya. So those people who are released from detention centers are now released into the community, in urban centers, in urban settings, where UNHCR, for example, operates 2 community centers that are supposed to provide assistance in Tripoli. However, a young Eritrean boy was killed in a shelter last week in Tripoli. That's not the first incident. We have had regular incidents of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers being killed as a result of violence, either being shot by security forces, being shot by armed groups, being shot by criminal groups, being killed in revenge by smugglers after they had rebelled against the smuggler or trafficker. And so Libya is really not a safe place for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. This is reiterated regularly by the UN. We are witnessing it as well as a medical organization currently present in Tripoli. And we also see that the services available to those who have been released into the community are extremely limited. UNHCR provides a bit of financial assistance, but evacuation flights have resumed, but we only had one for the moment. It's not clear when it comes to repatriation flights. IOM themselves admit that they have a backlog of about 3,500 people who want to go back home, but who are not able to go back home. So this is a bit the situation. A lot of vulnerabilities with no proper systems to deal with these vulnerabilities, with UNHCR, IOM, other protection agencies being quite weak in their ability to operate in Libya. And that means that for some of them, going on a boat might appear as the only solution in order to flee Libya. And that would with the link with what Judith would be talking about. But maybe one last point on COVID, it's very difficult to assess. We know that the figures are increasing. However, we also know that the testing capacity in Libya are quite limited, that you have a divide between Tripoli and then the rest of the country, and whether we are getting information coming from more remote areas. But we got a glimpse into what was happening to migrants and their vulnerability to COVID by the number of people who tested positive after they had been rescued and put in quarantine in Italy. And for some of them, it's a young population. You hardly had any case. But for others, there are sometimes rescues where we saw that about half of the people who had been rescued later tested positive to COVID. And that's really it's the only indication for us of how serious COVID is among the migrant refugees and asylum seekers community in Libya. I hand over to Judith now, who's going to talk to us about the situation at sea. And I hope that I've explained what are the push factors that are forcing migrant refugees and asylum seekers to risk their lives and try to reach European shore on flimsy boats. Thank you.
Before going to Judith, I would like to remind our audience to write down their questions down anytime they want. And we will collect them and direct to our panel in the second part. Yes, over to you, Judith.
Okay, thank you. Let me know if there are any problems with audio, obviously. Thank you both for your very clear presentations. I hope that I will be as clear. I will discuss the situation in the Central Mediterranean and what happens when people are rescued or otherwise reach European shores in the current context. Let me just make three main points, which I'll try to develop as I go forward. I don't think that we can say that the pandemic has significantly affected the numbers, the choices or the numbers of people fleeing Libya in particular, trying to reach European shores. I think we can definitely say, though, that the pandemic has impacted very significantly the ability of rescue organizations to perform search and rescue in the Central Mediterranean where they are most needed, and has had also a significant impact on disembarkation protocols and the treatment of people once they are disembarked, and the ability and willingness of EU countries to participate in relocation programs. And I think it's fair to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has served as yet another pretext for violations of people's rights at EU borders. We did see just a brief moment on statistics. I know it can be a lot, and I don't have slides, so you'll just have to take notes. But it is important to get the numbers out there. Although there was a brief dip in the numbers of people arriving or attempting crossings in March and April, sort of the height of I guess we should call it the first wave of the pandemic in Europe. After that, crossings resumed and attempted crossings resumed. And we've seen roughly similar numbers from Libya in 2020 as we did in 2019. Overall, the numbers are much higher this year, but that is largely due to a significant increase in the numbers of Tunisians who are making the journey. And that may well be what could be termed pandemic displacement, but that's not the topic for today. UNHCR estimates that calculates that around 12,835 people so far have reached European shores from Libya. The overall number is around 33,000. There are some differing numbers out there, but again, a large, around almost 14,000 people have come from Tunisia, and about 5,500 from a variety of other countries, including Algeria and Egypt. Which doesn't mean they're all Algerians and Egyptians on the boats, right? It's just that that's where the boats left from. There have been at least 693 deaths at sea so far this year. As we all know, those numbers can actually tragically be much, much higher because many shipwrecks may be never known about, never documented. As Erman said at the beginning of this conversation, at least 100 people died last week alone, including, as I'm sure many of you heard about, a 6-month-old baby who was rescued but later died. That baby and his mother were rescued by Open Arms, by the Open Arms rescue ship, which is run by a Spanish NGO called Proactiva Open Arms, which is right now the only rescue organization operating in this, or had been operating in the central Mediterranean. Their crew is right now under quarantine per the protocols in place in Italy, which I'll describe in a minute. I did want to, in just finishing with the statistics, note that while some 12,000, almost 13,000 people have reached Europe from Libya, IOM, the International Organization for Migration, calculates that at least 10,300 people have been intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard, which received significant support, both logistic and political and financial, from the European Union and individual member states like Italy. So 10,300 people have been intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard and returned to Libya, where they face the kinds of vulnerabilities and abuses that Hasiba was describing, both inside detention centers and in the community. So a word on rescue and surveillance at sea. As I said at the beginning, the pandemic has definitely impacted the ability of rescue organizations to operate at sea. We have seen over the last number of years concerted efforts by the European Union as a whole, by individual member states, to constrain the ability of non-governmental organizations to perform search and rescue at sea. The pandemic added another layer to that. As I mentioned, the only rescue group that was out there very recently was Open Arms. Italy adopted quite early Italy and Malta declared their ports, quote unquote, unsafe in April of this year due to the pandemic. And Italy, though it did actually then continue to allow organizations to disembark in Italy, it routinely impounded the ships, seized them on administrative grounds, and placed crews under quarantine, which obviously led to significant delays in the ability of those ships to get back out into the central Mediterranean to perform their vital search and rescue operations. And on that note, I would mention that there are no European Union naval assets in the central Mediterranean in international waters off the Libyan coast right now. There is some EU aerial surveillance by Frontex and EU NAVFOR Med, which is a naval mission, an EU naval mission in the central Mediterranean. And there are two planes operated by a non-governmental organization called Sea-Watch, which also surveils the area and notifies competent authorities when they see overcrowded, unseaworthy boats in need of assistance and rescue. But otherwise, you know, besides all the commercial ships that are out there, which are often called upon and often do their important duty to rescue people at sea, it's quite a desolate expanse of water right now compared to other times of the year, which has not dissuaded people from attempting what is, as we all know, an incredibly dangerous and often fatal journey. So we've seen, you know, how the pandemic has affected rescue at sea. I want to say a few words about how it's affected the way in which member states are taking in people who are rescued or otherwise reach their shores. As I mentioned, both Italy and Malta declared their ports quote unquote unsafe in April due to the public health emergency. Both of them have over the months adopted quarantine or quasi-quarantine or pretend quarantine, I would say, protocols, some of which have raised some very serious human rights concerns. Both countries continue to privilege cooperation with the Libyan Coast Guard, focusing on supporting the ability of the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept boats and return people to Libya, again, despite the overwhelming evidence of brutality against migrants and refugees in Libya, including but not limited to official detention centers. So let me just go talk a bit about Italy and then Malta, and then I'd like to say a few words about the EU response as a whole. So as I said, Italy has allowed many rescue organizations to disembark people on its shores. It began fairly quickly systematically imposing quarantines on NGO rescue crews as well as rescued persons. It started contracting very large passenger ferries to accommodate people during quarantine. There have been some concerns about that. Conditions on board appear to be relatively adequate and with fair treatment and appropriate quarantine measures in place. There is a question around access to lawyers, access to aid groups, access to UNHCR on these ships, and a question about whether people could have been accommodated on land, to say the least, as a kinder measure to people who had already spent a long and often traumatic period of time at sea on their journeys. But those passenger ferries continue to exist, and I will say certainly represent a better alternative than the incredibly overcrowded and wholly unsuitable reception center / detention center on Lampedusa, which has a capacity of around 200, and as of November 9th was hosting over 1,200 people in conditions that it's quite hard to imagine that they're able to actually enforce, respect quarantine measures, isolation measures, and then basic social distancing and other preventive measures that Hasiba was describing earlier. And I would say that children there are a number of unaccompanied children who brave this journey by sea, both from Libya and Tunisia. And thankfully, Italy did start removing them, not keeping them on the passenger ferries for quarantine, and making sure that they're quarantining in appropriate onshore facilities. So I think just on these quarantine measures, I mean, I think we could probably all agree that it's reasonable to quarantine people who are arriving. But it's also clear that Italy has implemented these quarantine measures in a fairly discriminatory way, right? Because many travelers coming by plane with visas from high-risk areas with, very high rates of infection for COVID-19 have not endured the same kind of enforced quarantine and testing period. So just to note that. And of course, the context for all of this is Italy's continued support for the Libyan Coast Guard in February of this year. So before the pandemic really hit, it's called a memorandum of understanding and agreement between Italy and the government of National Accord in Western Libya. That agreement was automatically renewed for another 3 years. And while Italy proposed some cosmetic changes that would, include some better language around respect for human rights and for example, gradual closing of these horrific official detention centers in Libya. As far as I know, Libya has not yet agreed to those even cosmetic changes, and we certainly haven't seen anything in writing yet. And at the same time, this year, Italy did go ahead with commissioning 6 new patrol boats that it will donate to Libya to increase their ability to patrol territorial waters and intercept people trying to flee Libya and reach safety in Europe. As I mentioned, Malta also declared its ports unsafe and subsequently engaged in quite a number of activities that were deeply distressing and very clearly violating the rights of migrants and refugees trying to reach safety by sea. There were various incidents that have been very well documented in which Malta delayed rescue, refused disembarkation, rendered some assistance to people at sea only to then sort of point them in the direction of Italy without rescuing them and taking them to Malta, and also coordinated pushbacks by commercial vessels to Libya, where people were then, of course, disembarked, and some of whom were detained. And there was, to mention just 2 incidents, Italy refused to disembark quite a small number of people. I think it was 27 people who were rescued by a Danish-owned commercial vessel for weeks on end, refused to allow them to disembark. And finally, Italy took them in what became known as the Easter Monday pushback. Malta basically contracted out a commercial vessel called the Dar al-Salam to respond belatedly even to a overcrowded, unseaworthy boat. Reportedly, several people had died between the time the presence of the boat was alerted to Malta and the time they dispatched this commercial vessel to respond to the situation of distress. That commercial vessel took people back, took all the survivors back to Libya. That case is now the subject of a big legal case in Malta against the government, where the survivors and some relatives of people who died are alleging that the Maltese government subjected them to inhuman and degrading treatment, collective expulsions, violations of their right to life, and the right to seek asylum. Sorry, is somebody trying to say something?
That's quite great information, Judith, but I would like to give some time to the questions as well, if you can. Yeah.
Okay, sure. I'll wrap up very quickly. Let me just, I'll skip over other nefarious things that Malta did, including detaining people for weeks on wholly unsuitable tourist ferries in international waters off the Maltese coast. And just mention that in all of this, the European Commission did issue its long-awaited pact on migration and asylum, which included some attention to issues around rescue at sea and disembarkation and relocation of individuals rescued at sea. And we could get into that in the question and answer period if people have questions about that. I would one final thing is that the Commission did in April issue some guidelines on access to asylum during the pandemic, in which the Commission, clarified very explicitly that border closures could not affect the right to seek asylum, and that member states had an obligation to ensure the entry to persons in need of international protection or who must be admitted for humanitarian reasons. What we've seen, however, is some significant efforts to actually prevent that from happening. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we saw that both in Libya and in the sea, what has been happening lately. In the Libya, for migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, and as well as help workers, international NGOs, since the COVID-19, their life is more miserable, and also the COVID-19 didn't affect the number of people starting this dangerous journey in the Mediterranean. So, and again, COVID-19 affected their life negatively from many aspects. So if you go to the questions, Sarah is asking about the EU member states. So what are they doing and why they are not acting so significantly? The question is, and I can combine this question to the latest EU Commission proposal to the about the asylum and migration management procedure, which will replace the Dublin regulation. So if you can answer both of them together, I will be very happy. Maybe we can start with from Hasiba. Would you like to pick this up?
Sure. I think the European states are just in a logic of border control, whatever the cost sometimes, rather than in a logic of saving lives. And as an illustration of this, maybe I'll start with highlighting how European states, and Judith has mentioned that, have completely withdrawn from the area so that their ships do not have to do rescues of boats of migrants. So to give you an example, so we had Operation Sophia that deliberately, and later Operation Irini, deliberately disengaged from the area so that they did not have to do rescues. Operation Irini even have it in its mandate that their ships have to stay off 100 kilometers or miles off the coast of Libya. And they also say that should they start doing rescues, then member states would reassess Operation Irini and how it functions. So here, everything is done to not try to save people who are risking their lives at sea. The other thing that European states are doing is they're doing everything for people not to reach European shores, including engaging in conducts that are highly problematic if lawful. So all the support that the European states, in one way or another, are providing to the Libyan Coast Guards and presenting it as measures to save lives, seems to be actually a deliberate strategy of these countries to try to avoid their responsibilities when it comes to saving lives, the prohibition also of sending back people to a place where their lives would be at risk. So what they do is that they enable the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept these people from international waters and bring them back to Libya, where they're either going to be detained or end up or vanish upon disembarkation and might end up in the very networks of smugglers and traffickers that European states are saying they're trying to fight. But that support to the Libyan Coast Guard, it's almost an unconditional support. We provide you with all the equipment you need, no questions asked, in spite of evidence of problematic conduct by the Libyan Coast Guard, reckless conduct. And but that again, if the idea is to stop people from reaching European shores rather than really saving them, then you see how European states are doing that. And the last point that the European states are doing is that they're also, well, 2 points. They're sharing information. So Judith mentioned the planes of Frontex or Operation Irini. They share information about boats in distress for the Libyan Coast Guard to go and pick them and bring them back to Libya. Even if you have other boats, including NGO boats, that might be closer to that boat in distress and might be able to provide assistance. It shows again the logic of interception of people rather than the logic of saving lives. And the last trend in the strategy of European states has seen also, not only have they disengaged, but they want to make sure that NGOs such as MSF are not able to do search and rescue. And I think Judith has talked to this point. So altogether, it is that, that logic of border control, stopping people at any cost that seems to prevail. And that, unfortunately, is also reflected in the Migration Pact. And these provisions that are on search and rescue, as MSF, we operate together with Sea-Watch, one of the search and rescue ships. We think that the European Commission is completely off mark here. The issue is not the safety of navigation as ostensibly stated by the Italian authorities, when they said that they care so much about the well-being of the people who might be rescued at sea, that they want to make sure that the NGO boats that are doing this are meeting the best possible standards, when in reality, we believe that this is it's a politically motivated move and an abuse of a legitimate procedure in maritime law to inspect ships. And to give you an example, when the Sea-Watch 4, the ship on which MSF is present, we had to go through an 11-hour inspection by the Italian authorities. So they go on the boat and they try to find faults. We've tried, and it goes from a leaflet on the boat that was in German only and not in English, to a missing light, to also asking us for certification that we do not exist in German law, and this is where the ship is being registered. So not super impressed with the approach of the European Commission when it comes to search and rescue. And we believe that we are in a logic of criminalization of search and rescue and criminalization of the work of NGOs. And that European countries are buying into that narrative that is about controlling, ensuring the safety, when it's actually about blocking NGOs.
Judith, would you like to add something?
Sure, I'll just add something about the issue around the disembarkation and relocation, because of course the unequal distribution of responsibility, let's say, for people arriving irregularly in Europe is one of the major, it's like the Gordian knot of migration and asylum policy in the EU, and it remains so. With countries like Italy and Malta, you know, saying that they are unfairly burdened with having to take in so many people, and that they need quote unquote solidarity from other EU countries. And then you have countries like Hungary leading a minority of EU countries rejecting absolutely any kind of sharing of responsibility. The European Commission, in its pact on migration and asylum issued in September of this year, proposed once again a kind of new system for relocating people from quote unquote frontline countries, so countries of the EU on its external borders. You know, it's still too early to say what will happen with that. That proposal will be debated in different fora, and ultimately will come down to the political will of a number, well, of all of EU countries. It is depressing, though, to see how difficult it is for a collective of relatively resource-rich, advanced democratic countries that we're seeing backsliding in a number of EU countries, but generally speaking, no, a wealthy bloc of advanced democracies unable to come to some kind of reasonable, fair agreement about how to take responsibility for, you know, processing, compared to the overall population of the EU, a pretty small number of people, many of whom are in need of some kind of protection, others who may have a lot to contribute to our societies and our economies, all of whom deserve fair treatment and an examination of their personal circumstances.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about the economic conditions in Libya. Do people have enough resources to sustain their life? Maybe I can pick up this one very shortly, then Judith and Hasiba can add if they would like to add anything. The daily life of Libyans going from bad to worse since the military ease off, other problems like the collapse of economy and worsening living conditions started to be more visible again in the September and October. Despite the COVID-19, Libyans organized crowded street demonstrations against the difficulties in their daily life, including power shortages, gas shortages, water and cash shortages as well, and lack of other essential services in their daily life. So we witnessed these protests on both sides of the country, I mean in the east and in the west, both in Tripoli and Benghazi. These demonstrations were quite powerful because of the protests. Head of the interim government in the east of Libya submitted his resignation. The office of the House of Representatives is torched. Even Haftar was quite anxious about the happenings. In Tripoli, protesters shook the ground on which the JNA alliance stands. Sarai, the prime minister, declared that he is willing to step down and hand in his responsibilities to a new government, etc. So these are the problems related to the economic conditions in Libya. And with an eye to the low oil prices, COVID-19 related economic stagnation, Libya's misgovernment, and the oil production, it was blocked since the late January 2020, which was removed lastly, and production rates going to the previous numbers and recovering. But the financial problem seems not likely to be solved quickly, and the ailing economy may prevent the urgent investments needed to improve the living conditions of the Libyans. Not so likely. So we may see more social disturbances in Libya. Before going to the next question, I would like to ask to Hasiba about the argument of the European Union. We hear that this is the search and rescue operation area of the Libyan Coast Guard's international, this is their international responsibility, etc. What would you like to say about it?
Maybe I'll add something on how hard the situation is for Libyans. It's also due to the conflict. You had about 200,000 internally displaced people who had lost their houses or were not, or had to leave the areas where they were living in order to avoid the fighting. And those are also extremely vulnerable. So while we're here focusing on migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, this is happening against the backdrop of a state that is struggling, and Libyans are struggling a lot, and we know that, and we see that, unfortunately. When it comes to the Libyan search and rescue region, so I'd like to distinguish like EU member states from European institutions per se. What we know is that the Libyan search and rescue region, it's a very interesting slip of the tongue here, has been spearheaded by Italy. We've seen some of the documentation that was submitted by the Libyan authorities to the International Maritime Organization for them to recognize the search and rescue region of Libya were actually drafted by Italy. We also know that considering the very limited capacity of the Libyan Coast Guard, the portion of the Mediterranean Sea that they are claiming to monitor in order to ensure search and rescue and coordinate search and rescue, it's disproportionately huge. It's almost half of the Mediterranean Sea. The search and rescue region of Libya goes up to 90 nautical mile north. That's huge considering the capacity, again, of the Libyan Coast Guard. Unless the idea behind this Libyan search and rescue region is, again, not to actually coordinate effective rescues, but is actually about making sure that a whole portion of the Mediterranean Sea becomes the sole responsibility of Libya, and therefore justifies the fact that European states are not carrying search and rescue region, but also justifies that NGOs are kept out of this area. And then on top of this, you have an interpretation by the Libyan authorities of the search and rescue region as meaning their waters, which is wrong in international law. They simply have the responsibility to coordinate search and rescue in that area. And we have had several exchanges with the Libyan Coast Guard where they tell us to leave the area, even if there are boats in distress. So I think the expression I used to say is why European ships are not there, the fingerprints of European states are all over the area. I don't know, Judith, if you have something to add to this or if I might be a bit too harsh.
No, I have nothing to add. That was very complete.
Thank you. And let me go to the next question. It's about US presidency. Should we expect important differences in US Libya policy? Again, I might say something first, then leave the floor to our other distinguished guests. Although the final election results have not been declared, vote counts show that Biden has been elected as the 46th president of the US. The crisis in Libya requires a strong US commitment, at least to deter the external and internal spoilers and encourage all actors to compromise. As far as I can see, Biden did not promise such a commitment to Libya as well, like Trump. So in that sense, there won't be much for Libya. However, Biden was promising to prevent unilateral actions of some strong men in the region like Putin, Erdogan, or Sisi. If Biden decides to act against these actors in Libya, then it might be a game changer, I think. So let me check if we have any other questions. I don't see any other. Let me ask Hasiba and Judith, would you like to add anything else before closing up?
Maybe to follow up on the last question, I think it is imperative for the International Maritime Organization to review the search and rescue region of Libya in light of the conduct of the Libyan Coast Guard, the fact that they're not reachable, and in light of the recent shipwrecks as well. Clearly something that should happen is not happening here. And as working for an organization that is currently willing to be at sea and willing to do search and rescues, but who cannot because the ship is detained, the hope that we'll stop with the silliness of blocking NGOs and letting them at least carry out their activities in line with international law. And what we've seen is a lot of discourse, a lot of nice words being said by a number of European officials, but we also see the policies and how they're implemented. And there's a huge gap between what is said and what is done. And NGOs doing search and rescue, and mainly migrants and refugees risking their lives at sea, are paying the price of that gap between the rhetoric and the actions of European states.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'll jump in with a final word just to, well, obviously agree wholeheartedly with what Hasiba just said. But just to say that to my mind, and I think many share this, you know, the EU's willingness to collaborate with and support the Libyan Coast Guard for the purposes of, you know, blocking the boats is the most visible and tragic expression of the EU's fixation on stopping the boats, on deterring arrivals and preventing arrivals by any means necessary. And it is a huge stain on the EU's reputation as a defender of human rights, as a force for human rights in the world, and I think will be judged is already being judged very harshly, and will certainly go down in history as a mistake and an abdication of EU responsibilities and values. So, you know, the first thing is to ensure search and rescue at sea It would be great if the EU itself were living up to its responsibilities in that respect, but at the very least, it should not be obstructing NGO rescue at sea. And the EU needs to get really serious about sharing responsibilities so that the migration policy is reasonable and shared and fair. And it also needs to get really serious about expanding safe and legal channels into the EU for workers at all levels, so that we can really minimize the number of people who, and of course, safe and legal channels also for asylum seekers and refugees, huh? But in a way so that we can really try to minimize the numbers of people who have to embark on these incredibly dangerous migration journeys.
Okay, so that's it from us for today. Before closing, I want to thank to both Hasiba and Judith very much for their invaluable insights, and thank you our audience for joining us. Please don't forget to check the Horizon websites to read Horizon weekly reports and stay updated about the most prominent crises around the world. You can follow the announcements of upcoming webinars and other events from the Horizon newsletters or social media accounts. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.